Okay, good evening. Welcome to week 3 of the Shemita course. I want to dedicate this shiur Le'ilu Nishmat Gila Bat Yechezkel, to the memory of our dear friend Gila Lera, who passed away on Sunday evening. And I've just rushed over back from the Shiva now, and this shiur is dedicated to her memory. She was a very special lady, and we should, her neshama should have an aliyah from this learning. Okay, into the nitty gritty now. We spent the last 2 weeks going through the basics, the halachot, where they came from, the psukim in the Torah, explaining to us where, am I recording? Yes, I am recording, yes, okay. Where the mitzvah is mentioned in the Torah, we went through that. We went through the different things that we can't do: planting, sowing, reaping, harvesting, gathering, all those things. We went through the kind of things you can do. And we went through the halachot, and we learned that you are meant, if you can, to eat the produce of Shemitah, because the pasuk tells us it is le'ochla, to eat. So now we're going to get into the practical side of things. Having formed the basis of where we're coming from with Shemitah, we can now build on our knowledge of the Torah laws and the rabbinic laws of Shemitah to build up a picture of how we need to behave within the Shemitah year regarding the produce. I sent out a handout. Those of you who have got it on your screen or printed it out, all well and good. If not, don't worry, you can print it out at the afterwards. By the time we've finished, source sheet number 1, which is the one we used for the last 2 weeks, this one which we're going to use today, and next week's one, which will be the last one, that together, those 3 handouts will constitute for you a basically a handbook of Shemitah, and really ought to contain most of what you need to know to get through Shemitah in a correct way and to fulfill the mitzvah in the best possible way. So the handouts are not just to follow the shiur, they're also designed to be a resource for you throughout the coming Shemitah year. So I'm going to share the screen with you, which is the source sheet that I sent out. So if you don't have it in front of you, don't worry, it's going to be on the screen in a second. I'm hoping that you can see that now. Give me a thumbs up, somebody. Yes, okay, Michael's giving me the thumbs up. Okay, you can see that, that's great. So let me just get that out of the way. Fine. So let's start with what potential difficulties we have as consumers during the Shemitah year. We have, I've split this up into 2 sections. Section A is the actual produce itself. So the apple, the banana, the vegetables, whatever it is we're talking about, the fruit, the vegetables, the produce itself. And B is the purchasing process. We're then going to go and have a look at what the solutions are to the difficulties that we present. And I'm going to present you with 4 different possible solutions in order of preference, really. So that will take us right the way down to here, which is on page 8. Now, I'm not going to read everything that's on here, and I'm not even going to discuss every single thing that's on here. The reason that I've made it comprehensive is for the reason I said before, is that you can print it out or keep it on your computer as a reference source sheet throughout the year. Of course, you also have the option to ask a question, to ask a shala of any competent rabbinic authority if you have got some questions about it. But let's go through it and see if we can understand everything that we need to about how we go about navigating our way through Shemitah year. So let's talk about the produce itself. We're going to come across some terms that we spoke about in the last 2 weeks as we go along, and you'll now see the relevance of those things that we spoke about earlier on, and you'll understand, I hope, why we spent 2 weeks doing the basics before we got to the practicalities. So the first thing is the produce itself. If we have produce from a shamur field, remember we spoke about shamur last week. This is a field which was not rendered ownerless. So the owner of the field failed prior to Shemitah to be mafkir, to make the field hefker. Now, we know that there is a mitzvah midoraita, a Torah law, to make the field ownerless. Whether or not the whole laws of Shemitah today are dioraita or drabanan is a matter of machloket. It doesn't matter to us really, because either way we're going to keep them, even if they're inverted commas only rabbinic. But the mitzvah to make the field ownerless is a mitzvah min Torah. Now, what happens if you have food in your house that was made in fields, picked or harvested in fields that was not rendered hefker? Now, the first thing is, in the first instance, if you know when you go into the shop that this is from fields that are shamor, then you shouldn't buy it in the first place. Now, this applies mainly, I guess, to the people who are living in Chutz La'aretz, because when you go into Tesco's or Sainsbury's or wherever it is that you shop, and you go to the fruit and vegetable section and you pick up your produce and it says produce of Israel, then the vast majority of that produce will be, depending on what time of the year it is, of course, it will be from fields that have not been subject to the laws of Shemitah, will not have been made mafkir, not have been made hefker, and therefore, in the first instance, you should avoid buying it. And that is why all of us folk who are either in Chutz La'aretz now or have spent some of our lives in Chutz La'aretz, we will remember that we did not buy Israeli produce during the Shemitah year. And the main reason that we did not buy Shemitah produce during the Shemitah year, we did not buy Israeli produce, is because of this idea of shamor. Because we can be pretty certain that the oranges, the vegetables, the apples, whatever it is, that's produce of Israel during that time will be from produce from fields which were not made hefker. Because sadly, the vast majority of agriculture in Israel do not follow the laws of Shemitah. So in the first instance, we avoid buying it. What happens if after the event? So in other words, you go to Tesco's and you buy your fruit and veg and you forgot to look where it was from, and you get home and you put it in the fridge, and as you put it in the fridge, you see the label and it says produce of Israel. What are you going to do with it now? So the question is, can you eat it? And if you can't eat it, what should you do with it? Well, the majority of the opinions of today's poskim follow that of Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who says that b'diavad, after the event, you can eat it. However, it needs to be treated with the appropriate kedusha of Shemitah, and we will talk about how to do that next week. But for the moment, suffice it to say that if you buy produce which is shamur by mistake, shouldn't do it in the first place, but if you buy it by mistake, you can eat it. You don't need to discard it. You can eat it. It is not treif. It doesn't treif up your kitchen. If you cut it with a knife, it doesn't mean you have to kasher the knife or any of those other things. It is not kosher. It is Shemitah produce and shouldn't have been bought in the first place. But since it has been, you can rely on the opinions that allow you to eat it. That's shamur. Now, the same thing applies to ne'evad. We spoke about this last week. Ne'evad, it comes from the word avodah, to work, la'avod. And the ne'evad are fields that were not left fallow. In other words, they were planted, they were harvested, they were fertilized. In other words, the farmers did whatever they normally did in their fields. And again, that produce shouldn't be subject to commercial trade. You shouldn't buy it. But if you did, it falls into the same category of shamur, and you can rely on the opinions that say you can eat it. So try and avoid it. If you're in chutz la'aretz, you can assume that the vast majority, and therefore all, of the Israeli produce, unless it has a hechsher that says lo chashash shmita or shvi'it, there's no worry about seventh year or Shemitah. Unless it has a hechsher, you shouldn't buy it. If you did buy it by mistake, then you can eat it. Okay, next bit, sefichim. Now this we spoke about in some detail last week. Literally, sefichim means the aftergrowth, or stuff that grows on its own. In other words, the tomato plants that just grow out of the compost that we spoke about last week, or the wheat that's left over from last year's planting that regrows, the seeds that have been planted or have come along on the wind and got themselves planted on their own. That's called sefichim. And this only applies to vegetables, not to fruit. Because of course, you can't plant a fruit tree by mistake. Right? A fruit tree a fruit pip, let's say, that gets planted by mistake in Shemitah is not going to give you any fruit for a long time. And anyway, you can't eat the first 3 years of a fruit tree because it's orla. So the idea of sefichim, stuff that grows on its own, does not apply to fruit. It only applies to vegetables. It also doesn't apply in the first few weeks of Shemitah. The reason for that, of course, is that it takes a certain period of time for these vegetables to grow. And so if you have a vegetable that you see in your garden on the 3rd of Tishrei, 3 days after Shemitah has started, clearly that vegetable was not planted in Shemitah year. It was planted before Shemitah, and there is no problem with you eating that vegetable. So you're going to ask me, well, how do I know what time of the year each vegetable becomes forbidden from the point of view of sefichim? And there is a chart that is available. I've not seen one come out yet for this Shemitah. I can't send you the one from last Shemitah, of course, because it's slightly different, because Shemitah starts, although it starts the same time every year in the Jewish calendar, it starts on the 1st of Tishrei, it doesn't start the same time in the English calendar. So there will be a chart, which will be published, I imagine, in the next couple of weeks, of when you have to stop eating certain vegetables, or at least when you can assume that vegetables in the shops are no longer okay from the point of view of Shmita growth. Once I find that, I will copy it with permission, and we'll send it out to everybody so that you can know when to do what. So Sefichim only applies to vegetables and not fruits, and not in the first few weeks. And it also does not apply if it's grown by a non-Jew, and we will come back to this later on. Why is it not? Does it not apply to to stuff that's grown by a non-Jew? Because the psukim say, Nazirecha, your vineyards, Karmecha, your vineyards, Tuvuatacha, your produce, Sadacha, your field, meaning that which belongs to the Jewish people. So if it's grown by a non-Jew, then it does not, the Isur of Sefichim does not apply. Now, the interesting thing is that it also doesn't apply in parts of Israel which did not return to Israel's possession after the return from Bavel. You'll recall the history of the Jewish people. After the destruction of the first temple, we were exiled. First of all, before that, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel had been exiled already. We were left with just the tribes of Yehuda and Binyamin. And we were exiled after the Churban Bayit Rishon, after the destruction of the first temple. We were exiled to Bavel, to Babylon, current day Iraq. We were there for a period of 70 years before we were allowed to return back to Eretz Israel, not under our own sovereignty, but from the permission of King Dariavesh, King Darius, who allowed us to begin the process of the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, when we returned to Israel, we did not regain the entirety of the biblical land of Israel. When I say the biblical land of Israel, you will find in a number of places in the Torah that the borders of Israel are delineated, and they go right up to Damascus, and they go right down to the borders with Egypt. But we did not regain the whole of the biblical land of Israel when we returned from Bavel. And the Shemitah laws only apply to the parts of Israel which we lived in, we gained possession of when we returned after Galut Bavel, with Shivat Zion, with the return to Zion. And that means that places in the southern Arava, for example, Eilat, are not considered part of Israel from the point of view of Shemitah. And any produce which is grown in the southern Arava, in the area, in the southern Negev, around the Eilat area, is not considered to have Kedushat Shvi'it, is not considered to be Shemitah produce, and there is no problem with eating those, even if they are not been mafkir, even if they are ne'evad or shamor or sefichim, no problem. It also doesn't apply to vegetables grown indoors, that means in a place with a roof on, in a container which doesn't have a hole. We went into this in some detail with Vivian's pot plants. The same thing applies to the vegetables. So if you have a greenhouse, or a hothouse, I think the Americans call it, and inside that greenhouse, you have vegetable growing pots which do not have any holes in them. There's no connection. They are detached from the ground in all ways. In other words, for instance, in my wife's greenhouse, she has 2 parallel beds at the side. If she were to dig out all the soil and compost and line those beds with thick plastic which did not have any holes in it, and then put the soil and compost back, vegetables grown in that medium would be free of Kedushat Shemitah, because it's not grown in the land of Eretz Israel. It's grown in a sealed container, as it were, not connected to the land, and it's indoors. So we need those two coolers, if you like. We spoke about it in detail in week 1. So if you were to grow your vegetables, whatever they may be, cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers, whatever it is you want to grow, indoors in a non-hold container, then you don't have to worry about those at all. They have no kedusha of Shemitah, and you can do what you want with them. By the way, somebody asked me last week or the week before about mushrooms, and I said I didn't know, but I do know now. Mushrooms are not a vegetable. They have no roots. They are a fungus. There is no problem whatsoever with Kedushat Shvi'it with mushrooms. So mushrooms you can buy completely freely without having to worry about Shemitah at all. So that's the problem with the produce itself. The actual fruit or vegetable, is it shamor? Is it come from a field that wasn't rendered hefker? Is it nevad? Does it come from a field that was worked when it shouldn't? Or is it sepichim, vegetables that have been grown either on their own or deliberately after the first few weeks, grown by a Jew in proper Israel, outside in the land? And if it's all of those things, then we have to be careful what we do about it, because it has Shemitah Kedusha, and we'll talk about that shortly. So that is the first set of, I won't call it problems. Did I call it problems here? No, difficulties I called it. That's good. It's not a problem. It's a difficulty, but we can overcome difficulties. The second set of issues is the purchasing process itself. And this also impacts on where you shop in Shemitah year. There is a halacha which says that handing over money which has kedusha to an am haaretz or a non-Jew is not permitted. What's an am haaretz? An am haaretz is a person who does not, who is not scrupulous about keeping halacha. Somebody who will not be worried about doing the wrong thing al pi halacha. Now, as we've got written here, when you buy something which has kedusha, so Shemitah produce has kedusha. So if you have a field and you are mafkir that field, you render it ownerless, and you don't work it, and you have fruit or vegetables growing in that field perfectly legally, halachically, and somehow you're not meant to sell these things, but let's say you do, you sell that produce, the money that you receive for that produce takes on the kedusha, the holiness of the product. So when you hand over your money to the person selling Shemitah produce, they are receiving money which has kedusha. It has holiness. And there is a halacha that says you cannot use that money for things which are mundane. You can only use it for things like eating and drinking, because those things can be done with kedusha. You can't use it to buy services, so you can't use it. The Gemara gives the examples of a barber or a bathhouse attendant. You can't use money which has kedusha to pay for your haircut or to pay for your massage in the spa. Okay, you're not allowed to do that. it violates the kedusha of Shemitah, because the money takes on the kedusha of Shemitah. So again, if you are in Tesco's in the UK, or you are in Pick and Go in South Africa, and you pick up some vegetables or fruit from produce of Israel, that's probably got some kedushat shvit, because it's probably been grown in Shemitah year. If you buy that, you are falling foul of giving the money, which has kedusha, to somebody who shouldn't have it, and then they will use it in an incorrect way. And that you are transgressing a negative commandment of lifnei iver, before a blind person. You're not allowed to put a michshol, a stumbling block. So that means you're not allowed to set somebody up to fail. So if you buy kedushat shvi'it produce with money, and you give that money to somebody who's not going to use it correctly, you have set him up to do an aveira. So you have been over on lifnei iver. Now, that does not apply if you're buying with a check or with a credit card, because that is not a direct transaction. There is a third party involved in the transaction, either the credit card company or the bank. Some say that even banknotes are not counted. And most poskim say that they are counted, but the reason that some say they're not is because I don't know if they still do, but they used to say on banknotes, I promise to pay the bearer the sum of whatever it was. That's what used to be written on a £5 note. I don't know if it still is. Hang on a minute. I've got a £20 note here, in English £20 note. Does it say it? Yes, it does. It says here, here's my £20 note for those of you that can see it. I promise to pay the bearer. Can't read it, it's too small. The sum of £20. Anyway, so some people say that this is not also, kedusha doesn't go on it, but most people say it does. So if you find yourself in a situation where the only thing you can do is to buy kedushat shmita, and we'll see when that might be shortly, ideally try and buy it with a credit card, and then you haven't got the problem that we've got on the screen here. Number one, of handing over money which has kedusha to somebody who doesn't know what to do with it. That's number one, difficulty when purchasing. Number two is, well, you're trading, aren't you, in Shemitah produce? If you buy Shemitah produce, you're not allowed to buy or sell Shemitah produce. If you come into my garden during Shemitah and take my grapefruits, well, they're not mine because I've made them hefka. So number one, I can't sell something that doesn't belong to me. But let's say I was a naughty boy and I sold them to you. I have then been over the Aveira of trading in Shemitah produce. So the seller transgresses the Aveira of trading in Shemitah produce. You're not allowed to do that. And the buyer is doing lifnei iver, because you're coming along and buying something off me. If you didn't come and buy it, I wouldn't sell it. And therefore you, indirectly at least, have caused me to do an Aveira. That's lifnei iver. It's putting a stumbling block in front of a blind person. So that's difficulty number two. Difficulty number three is it is forbidden to weigh and measure Shemitah produce during a commercial transaction. So what does that mean? That means that how do we normally sell fruit and vegetable? By weight. You buy a kilo, you buy a pound, whatever it is, you weigh it, and according to the weight, that's how much you pay. But at Shemitah produce, you're not allowed to weigh and measure it. Why not? The answer to that is subject of a machloket, but the seemingly majority opinion of why you're not allowed to weigh and measure Shemitah produce is that by doing that, you are demonstrating ownership. Because why would I want to weigh and measure it except to quantify what I've got, either to sell or to put in my storehouse and to know how much I have? Remember, I'm allowed to eat Shemitah produce. I'm allowed to eat my own Shemitah produce. I'm allowed to eat your Shemitah produce, but only as much as I require. So why would I want to weigh or measure it? I just need to take as much as I need and estimate what I need. I don't wake up in the morning and say, I need to eat 1.35 kilos of tomatoes. No, I say I need to have a handful of tomatoes and a couple of cucumbers and whatever it is. So there is no reason to weigh and measure Shemitah produce except if you want to demonstrate ownership. And of course, ownership is something that doesn't exist when it comes to Shemitah because it is Heter. It is ownerless. That's the whole point. It is for everybody to eat. Le'evyonei amecha, to the poor people, to the animals, to the hired servants, to the slaves, everybody can get it. So it's forbidden to weigh and measure Shemitah produce during a commercial transaction. So if you go into your shop and you buy your Israeli produce, you can see that you are potentially coming up against quite a number of isurim, of prohibitions. So you are, first of all, you're trading in Shemitah. You're not allowed to do that. Secondly, you're going to measure it, because how else are you going to pay for it if you don't measure how much you've got? Thirdly, you're going to be handing over money which has got kedusha to somebody who's not going to do it. And fourthly, more than likely, you're going to be eating one of these three or all of these three categories, which you're not meant to do. So you can understand now, having seen what the difficulty with buying fruits and vegetables during the Shemitah year are, you can understand why we in Chutz La'aretz were always told, perhaps without enough education. I certainly didn't understand it. I mean, maybe you lot did, but I certainly did not understand the details of why I wasn't allowed to buy Israeli produce during Shemitah. I knew about Shemitah and I knew that the oil had to be left fallow, etc. I didn't realize at the time when I was living in Chutz La'aretz how many different isurim, how many different avirot you could do in one shopping trip to the shops. So it's now easy to see why we were always told, you know what, the easiest thing is just don't do it. You know, the opposite of Nike, just don't do it. Right? Don't buy the Israeli produce and then you won't come into any difficulties. Now, that is probably the best advice I can give to those of you who are in Chutz La'aretz during Shemitah year. However, those of you who are fortunate enough to be in the Holy Land have, as the title of this course was chosen, a once in 7 year opportunity to do mitzvot. It's not like in Chutz La'aretz where you have a once in 7 year opportunity to do averot, okay? Because the all you can do in Chutz La'aretz Nebuch is to do the averot of Shemitah. You can't actually do the mitzvot of Shemitah. It's just not possible, really. So you just have to avoid buying it. And I suppose the mitzvah in Chutz La'aretz is not to do the averot. So that's good. But in those of us who are fortunate to be here in Eretz HaKadoshah, the Holy Land, we have a once in 7 year opportunity to do beautiful, beautiful mitzvot, to actually appreciate the Kedushah, the holiness of the land, the holiness of the fruit, the holiness of the gift that we've been given by Kadosh Baruch Hu, the holiness of the gift that we've been given by having the opportunity to be here in the first place. And every shopping opportunity is an opportunity to do a very, very special mitzvah in Shemitah year in Israel. You know, we speak about the idea on Sukkot of elevating the mundane into holiness. By that I mean what's the mitzvah of Sukkah? Arba minim, yes, but the mitzvah of Sukkah is just to be in the Sukkah, to sit in the Sukkah, to eat in the Sukkah, to learn in the Sukkah, to sleep in the Sukkah, all straightforward things, normal things that the rest of the year are not a mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah to eat, not a mitzvah to sleep. I mean, it is a mitzvah to eat healthily and to sleep properly, of course, but per se, it's not a mitzvah to eat, it's not a mitzvah to sleep, it's not a mitzvah to sit. All of those things during the 7 days of Sukkot are a mitzvah. Every time you eat something in the Sukkah, you're doing a mitzvah. Just think about that. Amazing, no? Every time you go into the Sukkah and eat something, you're doing a mitzvah. So this is what it's like for the whole of Shemita year here in Israel. Every time you do this mundane act of going to the shops and buying produce, especially if you buy Shemita produce, which we will talk about in a moment, it's an opportunity to do a mitzvah. It's a once in 7 year opportunity. So if you think about it that way, what's the last thing we want to do? The last thing we want to do is to avoid buying Shmita produce. In Chutz La'aretz, you have no choice. You've got to avoid buying it because there's nothing you could do about it, because the stuff in the shops is all stuff you can't have. But here in Israel, we have an opportunity to do the mitzvah, to enjoy the mitzvah, to feel the kedusha every time we do it. I've said this to you before, but every time we here have a first fruit that comes out of our garden or a first vegetable, and Elisheva brings it in and says, this is the first strawberry, the first tomato, the first mango, whatever it is. And I take truma and masa and I cut off a bit and I wrap it up and I say the bracha. You've elevated a mundane activity into something holy. And that is something very, very special, which it's very easy to overlook that. But if we don't overlook it, and if we be very careful about that, we can really feel that Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael on a daily basis. So, whereas in Chutz La'aretz, all we can really do is to avoid buying Shemitah produce, I'd like to suggest to you that we should try our very hardest during the Shemitah year to actually buy Shemitah produce, or at least come across Shemitah produce, even if we don't buy it because we can't trade in it, and I'll come to that in a minute. We should go out of our way to try and come into contact with Shemitah produce, to treat it with the appropriate Kedusha, which will be the subject of next week's final shiur, and to enjoy the mitzvah and to share that mitzvah with our families in a way which elevates it into the holy from the mundane. So how are we going to do that? We've got these problems that we've spoken about, these difficulties. How are we going to deal with it? So let's look now at the solutions. Now, the best solution of all is something called Otzer Bet Din. And if we can keep this idea of Otzer Bet Din, if we're able to do this, then this is the way that we can fulfill the mitzvot of Shemitah to the highest possible degree. Now, I say right from the start that it is not always possible to do it for a number of reasons which will become obvious as we go through. And therefore, I urge none of you to say with any kind of potential neder, any kind of potential vow, anything that might be construed as a vow or a promise, to only keep Otzar Bet Din, because it's not impossible, but it's very, very difficult to only keep Otzar Bet Din. However, what I would urge you to do instead is to consider trying your best to use Otzar Bet Din as much as possible, and only use the other solutions when Otzar Bet Din is not available to you, which may be most of the time, but nevertheless. Let's go through what is Otzar Bet Din. Otzar means storehouse, and Otzar is a storehouse. You all know what a Bet Din is. It is the court of justice. It's the rabbinical court. So the Otzar Bet Din is a storehouse run by the Bet Din. Now, how did it all start? I've written out here for you a couple of pages you can see, which is a summary of Otzar Bet Din, and so you can read that at your leisure. I'm just going to go through, because of time is short, I'm just going to go through the bare bones of it, but it's all there written for you. What I've written there hopefully will be self-explanatory. I'm available for questions at any time via WhatsApp or email or phone call if you've got questions after you've read it all. Basically, the owner of a field is not allowed to commercially harvest his produce or sell it. He's also not required to provide stuff for me. He has to allow me to go and get it if I want it, but he doesn't have to do it for me. He's not obliged to deliver a bunch of grapes or a packet of tomatoes to my door. He's not obliged to do that at all. He's obliged to allow me to go and pick my own out of his field, as we've discussed. So if I want somebody to go on my behalf into the fields and pick those grapes or vegetables or whatever it is of Shmita produce for me, I would have to pay them to do it. Okay? Unless I had a very good friend who I could say, you know what? I could do with some grapes. Why don't you run down to the field of so-and-so and pick me a few grapes and bring them back? I know, somebody might do that for me if I asked them, but nobody's obliged to do that. So it is open to me to pay somebody to do that job for me. That's how the world runs, isn't it? You have a carpenter, so you pay somebody to do pay him to do your carpentry. Somebody who's a car mechanic, you pay him to do your car mechanic. Somebody can offer the service of going to get the grapes or the fruit or the vegetables for you. You're not allowed to buy the fruit, but you are allowed to pay somebody to go and get them. So the Bet Din sets itself up as an agent for the population that it serves, and it pays people to go into the fields, to pick the vegetables, to pick the fruit, to pack it, to transport it, and to bring it to the Otzar Bet Din, to the storehouse of the Bet Din. Now that storehouse might be a shop, it might be a factory, it might be a warehouse, whatever it is. So, because I don't have any bananas in my garden, and I want some bananas to eat, and I haven't got time to go up the coast to the north to find where the bananas are and pick them out of somebody else's field, of a Heter field, I can then go to the Otzar Bet Din and get my bananas there, because the Bet Din have collected them for me as my agent. Now, the Bet Din have had expenses incurred in going to get those products. They've had to pay somebody to pick them, to pack them, to send them, to store them, to put them in a fridge. They've had electricity to keep the fridges going. All of those things, the Bet Din are entitled to charge a fee for, because why should they pay for it? You want bananas, you have to pay, not for the banana, but you have to pay for the service that somebody did in getting that banana from the field, from the tree in the field, to the Otzer Bet Din warehouse, where you can then go and get it. So the Bet Din comes along, acts as the consumer's agent, and hires all the pickers and the packers and all those things, gets the stuff into their warehouse, and then they can divide the costs amongst the consumers. So, for example, let's say they bring in 100 kilo of bananas, and it cost them 1,000 shekels in expenses to bring those 100 kilos of bananas. That works out that every kilo of bananas has cost them in expenses 10 shekels. Okay, they've not bought the fruit, they've not bought the banana, they've only paid for the costs in picking, packing, transporting, etc. So the Bet Din will then say, okay, I'm going to now recoup those costs from the consumer. So I know that approximately every kilo of bananas has cost 10 shekels to get to the Otzer Bet Din. So I will then sell, in inverted commas, the bananas for 10 shekels a kilo, because that's what it's cost to get it there. Now, you're going to tell me, oh, but Lieberman, you just said you're not allowed to sell it and you're not allowed to measure it. So how are you going to do that? So any of you who live in Netanya, who have been down to the Meshek shop down by the train station, I know Hillary has been there because I took her once. They don't sell stuff by weight. What they do is they give you a plastic container, and they say you can fill that plastic container, and that plastic container will cost you 10 shekels or 50 shekels, or whatever it is. It's an estimate, and that's what they do in the Otzer Bet Din. They look at, they give you a receptacle, and they know that more or less that receptacle will hold a kilo, kilo and a half, whatever it is. They will set a price for that receptacle. So they're not measuring it, they're not weighing it. It's an estimate. And so the charge is that you pay will usually be less than the normal cost, because you're not paying for the product. You're only paying for the transportation and all the services that are done. Now, who do you think that the Bet Din employ to do all this transporting and picking and packing and all that nonsense? Well, of course, they employ the regular people who do it, because they're the ones who know how to do it. The farmer's there, he knows how to pick them, he knows how to pack them, he knows how to transport them. No point reinventing the wheel. So the normal farmer can pick and pack his produce, give it to the Otzer Bet Din, give it free of charge to the Otzer Bet Din, because it doesn't belong to him, and charge the Otzer Bet Din, charge the Bet Din a fee for doing the work. That's perfectly legal. What you are buying when you go to an Otzer Bet Din shop is pure Shmita produce. It's produce which has been grown and picked and harvested in strict accordance with the halacha. It has Shmita holiness. You are doing a mitzvah, min hamuvchar, the best possible mitzvah, when you go and get your fruit and veg from an Otzer Bet Din. And then, of course, all the halachot of the kedusha of Shemitah, of how you have to behave with this produce, which is what we'll go through next week, applies to those products. Okay, so that is why I have said that the best way of keeping Shemitah, the best solution is the Otzar Bet Din, because you are not doing any tricks of avoiding Shemitah like you have to do in Chutz La'aretz because you've got no choice. You are going out of your way to get involved with Shemitah, to do the mitzvah of Shemitah, to have Shemitah produce in your house. And of course, there's the added mitzvah that what's the whole point of Shemitah? Le'ochla, to eat it. You will be eating Shemitah produce. You'll be doing the extra mitzvah of actually eating Shemitah produce, a once in 7-year opportunity. So you can read this bit at your leisure because we're going to run out of time if I go through it all. It's very interesting to see how the modern Otzar Bet Din works, and that's all there for you. So that is the best way of keeping Shemitah. By far, the best way is to go to an Otzar Bet Din. Now, where do you find Otzar Bet Din produce? It's not on every street corner. If you live in a small yishuv somewhere where most of the people are not dati, most of the people are not keeping Shemitah, you won't find an Otzar Bet Din. You will have to go probably to one of the major religious cities. Netanya has an Otzar Bet Din shop. I'm not quite sure where it is, but I'll find out and let everybody know who lives in Netanya. Naharia definitely has. Yerushalayim definitely has. All of the cities where there is a significant Orthodox Dati population will have at least one Otzar Bet Din place. But they ain't on every street corner. You can't just nip out to the local Mega Ba'ir or the local Rami Levi Bishchuna. You've got to go out of your way to find it, which means you have to be organized. You have to go, make sure you get enough stuff till the next visit, etc. So it takes a bit of effort to buy Otzar Bet Din stuff, but if you can do it, if you know where it is, and the other thing is that you won't always find all the products all the time, because of course, we're very much dependent on the seasons, because we're talking about locally grown produce. So that's the best way of keeping Shemitah is Otzar Bet Din.
Oh, sure.
Faye, are you asking me a question? No. Okay. We'll just try and mute you then so we don't get a noise. Right. Number 2 best way, the second best way, is to avoid eating Shemitah produce. So, in Chutz La'aretz,
I'm sorry, I lost you for a minute. My question was something like Osher Ad, which is like a Haredi supermarket. Is there a chance that they might be, selling Otzar Bet Din?
there is a chance, but I'll come to supermarkets in a minute, and I'll discuss that in some detail. It's a good question. I'll come to that shortly. After I've spoken about the Heter Mechira, I'll come back to that.
Okay.
So number 2, well, basically everything else means you have to avoid buying Shemitah produce. Now, as we've said, that isn't the point of Shemitah. The point of Shemitah in Israel is not to avoid Shemitah produce. The point is to actually enjoy Shemitah produce, le'ochla, to eat it, and to have the kedusha of it, and to enjoy the kedusha of it, and to do the mitzvah of kedusha of it. But if you can't, because you haven't got your own garden, or you haven't got stuff local that you can just go into a field and pick your own, or you haven't got an Otzar Bet Din nearby, then you have no choice but to avoid the Shemitah produce. And there are basically three ways you can do that. Number one, which is number two here, which is the second best option after Otza Beddin, is Matzah Menutak, detached bedding. This is what we were talking about last week and the week before. Anything grown inside a house with a roof on, in a sealed unit, which is not connected to the ground, is not considered to be growing in the land of Israel and does not have Kedusha of Shemitah. So if you have a greenhouse with a roof on and you grow your vegetables in a sealed, non-hold container, that is as if you have grown it on the moon or in England or in Australia or in America or wherever. It's not grown in the land of Israel. It does not have Kedushat Shvi'it. You don't have to worry about Kedushat Shvi'it. You have not done the mitzvah of Kedushat Shvi'it by eating it, but you haven't done the Aveira of eating it, of eating the wrong stuff. So if you want to grow things, and this also, hydroponics also applies to this, because hydroponics, when it's done properly, does not involve growing stuff in the land. It's grown on water. So Matzah Menutak, growing it in detached bedding under cover, is one option to avoid eating Shemitah produce. And the third best option, or the second way to avoid eating Shemitah, is this thing called the Heter Mechira, which you will all have heard of. And I have given you a fairly comprehensive little essay here on the Heter Mechira. And it goes on to a few pages. And I'm not going to go through it now because we haven't got time, but you can read that at your leisure. And again, I'm available for questions at any time. Let me summarize what the Heter Mechira is all about. You'll all be familiar with the concept of selling your chametz before Pesach. Now, what is selling your chametz before Pesach? It is a proper sale. You are selling your chametz because you are not allowed to own chametz on Pesach. Is it a proper sale? Yes. Is it really a proper sale? Does everybody really consider it to be a proper sale? No. Most people think it's all a bit of a joke and a bit of a trick, and it's all a bit, dodgy, really, isn't it? We're not really selling it. The guy's not going to come and get it. Well, actually, if that's what you think, then you've got a big problem, because you actually kept chametz on Pesach. It is a proper sale, and you have to consider it to be a proper sale. But it's not without its problems. And it was really only brought in for those people who had massive amounts of chametz, people who had businesses like breweries and things, which was impossible to get rid of. If you've only got a little bit of chametz, get rid of it, don't sell it. So the Heter Mechira is a similar sort of thing. What the Heter Mechira says is that before Shemitah begins, I am going to sell my field in Israel to a non-Jew, which means that during Shemitah, the non-Jew owns the field, and therefore the produce which has been grown in that field has been grown by a non-Jew, not by a Jew. It's been grown by a non-Jew, owned by a non-Jew, and if you take you all the way back up the page to over here, to the idea of sfichim, does not apply if it's grown by a non-Jew. So the Heter Mechira, the Heter words mean, Heter means permission, Mechira, a sale. It's permission to sell the land to a non-Jew. So the produce that is grown in those fields which have been bought by a non-Jew and owned by a non-Jew in Shemitah year are not Shemitah holy produce. Okay? That is the concept of the Heter Mechira. You can read in the notes that I've given you the controversy of it. It is, one sec, Hillary, I'll come to you in a sec. It's not something that everybody agrees with. There are certain people who are vehemently opposed to it for a number of reasons. First of all, they say you're not allowed to sell land to a non-Jew. It's against the halakha. So the answer to that is, well, you know, this is a shat hadachak. It's a situation where we have no choice. This is the only option we have. There is another opinion that says that only applied when we first went into the land. There are various different opinions. You can read about it in the handout. Suffice it to say that many people, probably the majority of the modern Orthodox world, let's call it that, will accept the Heter Mechira. Not everybody, but many people in the Dati Leumi world, in the religious Zionist world, the national religious world, the modern Orthodox world, call it what you will accept the Heter Mechira. It's known as the Heter Mechira of Rav Kook, although as you'll see from what I've written, it didn't originate with Rav Kook. He renewed it, but it didn't originate with Rav Kook. Now, this is coming to answer Faye's question now. The vast majority of produce that you will find in the supermarkets today, not today because not Shmita, but in the Shmita year, will be Heter Mechira produce. You will find a seudah in the fruit and vegetables section, which if you read it carefully will say that the fruit and vegetables in this section do not have kedushat shviyit and are grown in accordance with the Heter Mechira. And the Rabbanut will give a hechsher to that, so that when you are buying your fruit and vegetables from a supermarket with a tu'udah, you are most likely buying fruit and vegetables with the Heter Mechira. You are not buying kedushat shmita vegetables. They don't have kedusha. They don't have the holiness. You don't need to treat them in the way I'm going to describe next week. What you've got to do with holy stuff. It is a solution by avoiding the fact that it is holy produce. It is not holy produce if you go by the Heter Mechira. Those that don't hold of the Heter Mechira wouldn't eat that stuff at all, because then it is grown out of accordance with Jewish law, because it's according to them it will be ne'evad, it will be produce which has been worked in a field, and it shouldn't have been, because the field shouldn't have been sold in the first place. The sale doesn't count. You're not allowed to sell it to a goy, according to those opinions that don't hold by the Heter Mechira. Most of the Haredi world do not hold by the Heter Mechira. I don't know about most. Much of the Haredi world, let's put it that way. I couldn't speak and say most. I think most, but I'll say much of it, and then I won't get myself into too much bother. Much of the Haredi world do not hold of the Heter Mechira. So if you hold of the Heter Mechira, then you can go to any kosher supermarket and buy. Now, Faye asked a question about Osher Ad, which is a Haredi outfit. I don't know the answer to that, Faye. What you'd have to do is to either find out what their policy is, bichlal, or if you go to Osher Ad supermarket, you will find a te'udah in their fruit and vegetables section, which will tell you what it is. It will say one of three things. It will say either it's otzar bet din, which means it's the best solution that we've already said, or it will say it's Heter Mechira, or, and I suspect that this is the most likely, although I don't know, I'm only guessing to be honest, it will say that it is Yevul Nochri, and that is number 4, which in my humble opinion, and I wrote the handout, so I'm allowed to write it, the worst solution of all is buying non-Jewish produce. You have no choice when you're in Chutz La'aretz to buy non-Jewish produce, because as we've said, you've got to avoid buying Israeli produce, because the vast majority of Israeli produce will be either shamor or ne'evad, or it will have been traded, Shemitah produce, which is traded, and you should avoid it. If you've already bought it, you can eat it, but you should avoid it. So you've got no choice but to buy Yavul Nochri. So you can buy stuff from Spain or Argentina or America or wherever. When you are in Israel, you're buying non-Jewish produce, you are buying it, and I'm going to be politically incorrect here, so I'm happy to be shot down. You are buying it potentially from our enemies. You are strengthening Arab agriculture in the land of Israel at the expense of Jewish agriculture. And for me, that is not what Shemitah is about. Shemitah is about the holiness of the land of Israel. It's not about supporting non-Jewish agriculture in the land of Israel. And in my view, that should be avoided. I, for one, Bli Neder, will not eat Yavul Nochri knowingly during Shemitah. Now, the question is, if you buy this, does it have Kedushat Shemitah? Does it have holiness of Shemitah? There are some people who say, and that's basically the minhag of Bnei Brak, that even Yavul Nochri has Kedushat Shemitah, and you have to treat it with Shemitah Kedusha that we'll talk about next week. However, most of the poskim outside of Bnei Brak, so Yerushalayim, everywhere else, believe that Yavul Nochri does not have Kedushat Shemitah, Kedushat Shvi'it, and you don't have to go to the lengths that we're going to talk about next week, how to treat Shemitah produce. So let's just summarize. We've used up our time. Let's just summarize. Everything is in the handout. Those of you that haven't got the handout that want it, contact me. I'll send it to you. Those who've got it, print it out and keep it. The problems of Shemitah. If you buy incorrectly, you should try not to buy stuff which has not been dealt with correctly by not being made hefker or not left fallow or grown when it shouldn't have been. If you do, you can eat them, but you shouldn't do it in the first place. The problem with buying Shemitah produce is that you have Kedushat Ksafim, you have the money has Kedusha, and you're not allowed to give that to somebody else who will misuse it. You're not allowed to trade in Shemitah produce. You're not allowed to measure Shemitah produce. Those are the problems. The solutions. Otsar Bet Din. Bet Din acts as our agents, collects all the Hefker produce and pays somebody to do that on our behalf. We then pay our share of the cost of getting that produce to the Otsar Bet Din. We pay that money in order not to buy the produce, but to pay for the service in getting it there. That stuff is the best stuff because it has Kedushat Shvi'it. We're doing the mitzvah of eating Shemitah produce. We're also doing the mitzvah of supporting the Jewish farmers who are going out of their way to keep Shemitah, and it's very hard for them. So we're also doing a mitzvah in that regard. And then the next way, if you can't find an Otzar Bet Din, and there isn't one on every corner, and you want to grow it yourself during Shemitah, or you find produce which is grown with a hechsher to say this is matzah menutak, these vegetables, gush katif, by the way, had a double whammy because first of all it was in the South Arava. It was south of the area that we got back when we went back from Bavel, so it wasn't applicable to Shemitah anyway. And they used to do a lot of hydroponics and matzah menutak. And Gush Katif used to provide a lot of the vegetables for the Haredi world during Shemitah. Sadly, Gush Katif no longer exists. So the second way is to avoid eating Shemitah produce. You can buy vegetables which are grown in a hothouse in detached from the ground, or you can buy hydroponically grown stuff. Third way of doing things is the Heter Mechira, which you can rely on because the vast body of rabbinic opinion proper first division guys allow it, and you don't have to worry that you're doing something wrong. You're not doing the best mitzvah. The best mitzvah is to eat Shemitah produce, but you're not doing anything wrong if you eat Heter Mechira produce. And finally, if you really have to, you've no other option and you're in Israel, then you can buy non-Jewish produce. And that does not, outside of Bnei Brak, does not have Kedushat Shvi'it. So, in my humble opinion, if you live in Israel, the way to behave during Shemitah is to either grow your own vegetables in a Shemitah-friendly, Shemitah-correct way, or go out of your way to go to the Otzar Bet Din. But you can rely on the Heter Mechira if you have to. So, for example, if you can't find an Otzar Bet Din, you can buy from a supermarket that uses a Heter Mechira. I would recommend to you not to buy from a shop which does not have any te'udah at all during Shemitah, because you may be buying Shemitah produce. So you should buy from a place that has a te'udah. That te'udah will probably tell you that it's Heter Mechira produce. You can rely on that if you can't get any other produce. You can also rely on the Heter Mechira if you go out to eat in somebody else's house or a restaurant that doesn't keep Otzar Bet Din, and they keep Heter Mechira. If I was to be invited out for a meal to somebody's house, and they were to say to me, by the way, we buy Heter Mechira, and I would say, that's fine, I can rely on that. I will do my best to try and buy Otzar Bet Din. I'm pretty certain that there will be times throughout the year, maybe a lot of times, who knows, where I can't get Otzar Bet Din stuff, and I will then rely on the Heter Mechira. But do not make a vow of any kind that you will only eat Otzar Bet Din, because you will end up either hungry or breaking your vow, because it's just going to be very, very difficult. What we can do is to recognize the once in a 7-year opportunity of keeping Shemitah and doing our best to eat Shemitah produce with the correct kavanah and the correct methodology that I'll go through next week, and trying our best to do that. Failing that, let's try at least not to do the Aveirot, and let's try numbers 2 and 3, and let's try and avoid number 4 as best we can. So I'll stop there, and I'll stop the share so that I can see you all better. I'll start with Hilary. Yes, Hilary, your question.
Okay. 2 things. First of all, the first thing that comes to mind is, as you mentioned, not selling our land to an Arab. Secondly, would we not have to sell the land before Shemitah started, in which case the fruit that was already growing there, or the vegetables that were already growing there, would be picked by them during the Shemitah year?
Okay, you're right on both counts. We've dealt with the idea of not selling land to non-Jews. There is an opinion, a strong opinion, that we're not allowed to sell land in Eretz Israel to a non-Jew. It's based on a pasuk in the Torah that says that when you come into the land, al techonem, do not favor them. But it's not universal. There is a heter to do that. Rav Kook, you can rely on Rav Kook, who said it was okay to do it. There's a discussion whether it was only okay in Rav Kook's generation because they were starving, but you can read about that in the notes that I've said. The second point that you make is correct. Fruits and vegetables that have done the majority of their growing before the Shemitah year can be picked in the Shemitah year. That's why I said at the beginning that the vegetables that grow in the first few weeks of the Shemitah year are not subject to Shemitah, because they are not Shemitah produce, because they were grown in year 6. And that's why there will be a chart that says that up to a certain date, you can eat carrots. Up to a certain date, you can eat potatoes. And there will be a date for each of those. And there will be a table produced which tells you exactly when you can eat things until. And once that comes out, I will send that out to everybody so that you know exactly what you're doing. So you're absolutely right. And you're also right in that the sale takes place before Shmita year in the same way as the sale of the chametz takes place before Pesach. No good doing it on Pesach, it's before Pesach. So the sale is done before Shmita year. Yes, Jonathan.
What about something like bread?
What about it?
Well, you're getting the corn from the earth, aren't you?
So this is the same question that you asked last week about your potato crisps.
Yeah.
Same question. And the answer is that anything that is made from Shemitah produce, so you will see during Shemitah year, when you buy a loaf of bread, let's say you buy a loaf of bread from a supermarket in one of those plastic packets, you'll have a Heter on it. And it will say kosher, and it will say lo lechashash shviit. It'll say you don't have to worry that this is Shemitah produce. It will have a Heter on it. And you're right, you should not be buying bread. You should not be buying bread from a place which does not have a Heter.
So that's the same for flour, using flour and making your own.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. When you go to Hillary, when you go to Rami Levy and buy your flour,
yeah,
it'll have a Heter on it.
Yeah.
Well, it'll say on it in Shemitah year. It'll say on it, you're okay with this. This is not Shemitah produce.
Okay.
Yes, Michael.
Right, you talked very early on about Shemitah only applies to the land after the return from Bavel, but surely the rules, the Shemitah rules, were set up in Torah. So why are we talking about after the return from Bavel?
I don't know, actually. I don't know. I also thought of that question, but I only read that earlier on this evening, so I haven't had a chance to look that up. It's a very good question. I don't know. If it was me writing the rules, I would have said anywhere in the biblical land of Israel. I don't know why it only applies to after Bavel. I suspect the answer is because when they came back from Bavel, the Shemitah rules were reset, if you like, for the land of Israel as it stood then. And of course, now we can't change them, can we? Because we're in the same business. Why do we have 2 days of Yom Tov in Chutz La'aretz? Because we can't change it because we haven't got a Sanhedrin. So I suspect the answer is that it only applied to what they had for practical reasons, right? And therefore we're stuck with that. That is what I think the answer is. But I will try and endeavor to try and find out whether that's true or not. That's what I imagine the answer is, that we are stuck with our time warp, lack of Sanhedrin answer to all the questions that apply to things back then. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I have one. In the number 3, where you have Svichim, what is the kavanah? Not if grown by a non-Jew. We import produce during the Shemitah year, so that we'll buy vegetables that are not grown here. So they're usually grown by a non-Jew. If it's a
that's right. It doesn't. Yeah, it means it doesn't apply to those vegetables grown by a non-Jew. So, for example, that's the basis of the Heter Mechira. Because if you sell your land to a non-Jew and the non-Jew grows those vegetables, then it doesn't count as Sefichim. That's why it's it does not apply to vegetables grown by a non-Jew.
Wait a minute, Svichim means grown during the, after the Shemitah begin? Oh, yeah. Okay, I didn't realize.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I just came in. I had to be out of the house for a while. I'll listen tomorrow morning to the Klita.
Okay, good.
Hey, Johnny.
Any other questions?
Johnny?
Yes, Jonathan.
So theoretically, it's really going to be impossible to go out socially eating, isn't it, to a restaurant? Realistically, isn't it?
Depends.
You're gonna keep-
This is why I said, if you were to take on a vow, a neder, I am only going to eat Otzer Bet Din, then yes, it would be impossible, because all the restaurants, I think, pretty much bar none, or bar very, very few. Maybe you'll find some in Mendorim or B'nai Brak, but all the restaurants that you and I would go to would use Heter Mechira vegetables, which is why I said to you, don't take upon yourself to only eat Otzer Bet Din, because then you won't be able to go out to visit anybody else, and you won't be able to go to a restaurant. What you should try and do is to say, I am going to do my best when I'm shopping and in my house to try and do as much as I can with Otzer Bet Din, because that's the best solution. If I can't get hold of it, I will eat Heter Mechira. If I'm invited out and I want to go, if you don't want to go, it's a good excuse. So I only eat Otzer Bet Din, I'm not coming. But assuming you want to go, then you can rely on the Heter Mechira. There's plenty of people with longer beards than you who rely on the Heter Mechira, and therefore it's not necessary to limit yourself to only Otzer Bet Din, although it would be a very good thing to make as much effort as possible to buy Otzer Bet Din for yourself. Is that clear?
Yeah, one other thing. You don't want to be rude, obviously, but supposing someone invites you out to their home, do you take it for granted that they are keeping, or do you ask them?
Well, that's a good question, because you're right, you don't want to be rude. Now, generally speaking, if you would go and eat in that person's house in the other 6 years, and you would rely on them to only buy food in a kosher shop, to only buy food, meat, for example, from a kosher butcher or from a kosher supermarket, then you can probably assume that those same people would buy their vegetables. However, there will be some people who don't understand the halachot, who haven't been to the shiur and haven't listened to the recording, and therefore don't know that it's not a great idea to go to the local Arab market and buy vegetables without a tu'udah. So you have to use your own seichel, I think. And I think, generally speaking, I think most people buy in supermarkets and in places with a tu'udah. If you think that there is a possibility that people might be a bit wacky and want to go and, and buy in these funny places, then maybe you should make a polite inquiry. But I would have thought that for you and for me, most of the people that we would eat at anyway, I think we could probably rely on that they would not go somewhere else. I don't think people would be offended if you said to them, do you buy your vegetables in Rami Levi or Osherad or Yochanan, or do you buy them in the local Arab market? I don't think people would be offended if they understood why you were asking that question. It obviously depends on how you ask the question as well. But I think it's a fair question, and I think you have to use your judgment. And if you are going to ask, obviously you have to ask in a sensitive manner. That's a very good question, actually, Jonathan. It's an important point. It's more of an important point, I suppose, in Chutz La'aretz, because in Chutz La'aretz, a lot of people don't really understand the whole concept of Shemitah. Not their fault. It's just not taught. I didn't really understand it, to be honest, until I came here. This is my second Shemitah here, and my knowledge about Shemitah is much greater this Shemitah than it was last Shemitah. I think most of the people that are in this forum here, who are listening here, are probably people who have come fairly recently, or I know some of you have been here 20, 30 years, but even so, that's only 2 or 3 Shmitas, and therefore, these laws need to be learnt carefully. Any other questions? Okay, we managed to get through an hour and a half almost, so I will stop the recording because there's no more questions. There we go.